Welcome to the nextTalk podcast, where we share real stories and practical advice for parenting the digital world.
We're your hosts, Mandy and Kim. Mandy is an award-winning author and the founder of nextTalk, and I'm the director of nextTalk, a nonprofit organization created to strengthen families through open communication. You can check out all of our resources at nexttalk.org.
We're wives, moms, and friends, tackling culturally relevant topics from a Christian perspective. We're sharing what we've learned and where we failed. We're so glad you're here for this conversation.
Boundaries. That is what we're talking about today. And I have to be honest, Mandy, it's huge. I feel like it covers and touches and relates to pretty much everything in life. So it's a big topic.
Yeah, I think we could take any subject and talk about boundaries and apply it, right? And we need to understand the importance of it, not only of teaching our kids how to set boundaries for themselves and modeling that, all of that stuff that we're going to talk about, but also respecting boundaries as well. Yeah. That's a whole other part of this conversation.
I was talking to my kids the other day and I was thinking about boundaries, and I was like, it was so important that God started with boundaries. He started the earth, created the earth with boundaries. Like, where does the ocean stop? Where does the sky and the land meet? Like, boundaries were there from the beginning. So we got to know they're important if God started with them, right?
Well, and that's like a geography boundary. You're talking about that, but my mind goes to the boundary of you can eat from any tree except this one. That was a boundary. Like the Lord said, listen, I've given you this garden, Adam and Eve, and enjoy it and, have an amazing life, but just don't eat this one fruit from this one tree, right? And what happened? Like, mankind couldn't respect the boundary. And
makes me feel better.
Never been the same since. All hell has broken loose.
I struggle with food boundaries too, Eve. I do, girl.
Bringing out that tub of ice cream.
I kind of wish it was forbidden, with a fence around it, but that's a story for another day. So I guess, we like to break it down. Like, what exactly is a boundary? I started with geography. You kind of went a different direction, but it really is what marks the end of one thing, like a property, and the beginning of another. And, it's easy to think about it like a fence, like your house, right? So you have your house, you got your neighbor. Where can I stop my sprinkler from watering? That's what I need to know. Like, where can my dog go and they're still on my property? That's a boundary. It's like a fence that gives us a clear line of what's ours and what's not ours.
And in relationships, it's the same thing, right? It's just, it's not tangible. You don't see it. But so we put up these emotional boundaries, physical boundaries, but those are through conversation. Like, this is my physical boundary with you or whatever. And so it's almost become like a way to define space between people. It's like an invisible fence, right? It's kind of what it is. And we have to communicate where it stops and where it starts and what we're comfortable with.
Okay, so clearly there's lots of different types of boundaries, but I think we can break it down into 4 main categories and tackle it that way. Physical, obviously, your actual physical autonomy. We've all felt that, when someone's up in your grill or up in your face. That makes me crazy. I don't know if I need like special boundaries, but when someone's like a close talker, that's a physical boundary. Like, step it back, friend, step it back. It makes me uncomfortable.
I'm going to take this a step farther, and everybody that knows me personally laughs at me about this, but like those people that hug and won't let go, I'm like, I like a good hug. I've learned to like.
You're so much better.
I used to hate hugging, and really only my really close personal friend. I'm like coming out today with this situation.
You're revealing the truth about yourself. I used
to not be a hugger at all, and I have learned to appreciate a good hug, but there are still some people that linger too long on the hug. So I'm like, okay, let go.
You know what the boundary on that is? The rub. Like, why are you rubbing my back? Too long, too intimate.
It's so funny. We're all learning. We're all learning and growing,
We're all
right?
learning. We're all learning. So yeah, everybody's got different physical boundaries. And then we have like the mental emotional boundaries, like what am I feeling? What's okay? What's not okay to say and to feel, and being very aware of that. That's a huge one. That's a huge one that we really need to be aware of and teach our kids. So we're going to talk through a lot of examples on that one.
The spiritual, boundary of what I believe, what's okay for my life, and what I feel like is not okay because it doesn't line up with God's scripture. And that's a whole thing too, because you're going to run into people with different boundaries on that. And then you're teaching your kids how to respectfully disagree, but maintain your boundary of your beliefs. And so that's the spiritual boundary. And then also the interpersonal boundaries, and so here we're talking about friendships, dating, all of that kind of stuff, family relationships, where you have to set some perimeters with the people you love and the people that are in your life. And so we're going to kind of dive into some examples there. The one that comes to mind immediately is, a friendship. And we did a whole podcast on navigating friendships, but we really have to help our kids when they come to us and they're like, oh, my friends are doing something I'm not comfortable with. Well, how do I communicate that? And you're literally teaching your kid to communicate a boundary, like saying to their friend, like, I love you, I want to be your friend, but I'm not going to do that. Like, I'm not going to bully that kid, or I'm not going to vape in the bathroom, or I'm not going to whatever. They're creating a boundary. That's the one that comes to mind, like right away when I think about interpersonal, but it's your relationships and how you're setting boundaries within that. I think that one's huge.
It is huge. And I feel like none of this is easy, and it can be overwhelming because it doesn't just affect parenting. Like everything we talk about here at Next Talk, it requires us to first look in the mirror, which is never easy. That moment where you step back and you take yourself out of the parenting mode for a minute and you say, okay, I also have to have boundaries and be clear about what they are. And so that kind of plays into where we want to go with this. Now that we've said what the boundaries are, there's kind of four main jobs that I think we have as a person, as a parent in this world. One, having boundaries for yourself. Like we've got to develop those. We got to know what they are. We have to be clear about them. Two, modeling those boundaries. And that means not just saying them, because it's easy to be like, oh, here are my boundaries. But if you say them and express them, and then your kids and your people that you care about don't see you actually living them out, then it's kind of a mixed message. And then maybe you really aren't clear and confident on your boundaries. And then there's the teaching boundaries, which is just an imperative part of parenting. Well, that was a mouthful. Kids have to take ownership. They really do. They have to be praised and encouraged and develop their own boundaries. And that's the huge parenting piece there, is how do we do that? How do we encourage them to do that? And how do we teach them to do that? And then what you mentioned earlier, Mandy, respecting others' boundaries. Yes, having our own. Yes, teaching our kids, but also teaching our kids that respecting other people's boundaries is critical. Like that's so important to our community and our world, that we learn how to respect other people's differences and boundaries.
Absolutely, Kim. So let's start out with the first one that you said, having boundaries. Okay. So what are our personal boundaries and what does that mean? And I think this is really a look in the mirror moment. I know for me, I suffer from people pleasing. Like that is something that I struggle with. I've always struggled with that. And so for me, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. And so I have had to create clear boundaries, especially in my role with nextTalk. Like that's where my spiritual beliefs come in. And I'm like, okay, this is what I believe. And this is what I'm going to say, even though some people may not agree with it. Like I've had to, that's just been a boundary. Like I have to stand true to who I am because I serve God, not people. Right.
Yep. Yep.
And that is something that I've had to work on. And I think too, on this people pleasing situation where we're looking in the mirror, I do want to note this. I think that our kids have been, and the more I've watched my kids grow up and, other kids and talk to families and stuff, they're growing up in a world where everything is be kind, be nice, which is an amazing message. I'm not knocking that message. That's a great message. But I think sometimes kids get confused that boundaries are mean. Okay. So for example, you have a girl and a boy in her class likes her. and he's spamming, DMing her on Instagram. He's all the things, right? And the girl has been like very kind. Oh, yes, you're such a nice guy, but I'm not ready to get in a relationship, or I don't want to date, or whatever. That is not being unkind, because you're clearly communicating a boundary. Now, if your girl is messaging back the guy, you're ugly, I don't like you, that's not a boundary. That's being unkind, right? And so there's a difference there. And I think we have to teach our kids, it's okay to say to someone, I don't want to go to that dance with you. Thank you for asking me, but no, thank you. Our world is kind of teaching our kids that they can't say no, really. That's why boundaries are such a big deal. It's why it's such a big conversation today.
I'm so glad you said that, because it made me think of two things. One, as parents, sometimes we want people to like our kids, and we can sometimes push our kids into being kind instead of being clear, because we're like, oh, you know what? The kids aren't going to like my kid, or they're going to, push him out of the popular group, or he's not going to be invited. And we make it about ourselves. We want our kid to be liked. And so instead of encouraging our kid to be clear and stand on what they know and what they believe, sometimes we can muddy the waters for them. And that's not good either. And then the other thing that came to mind is, I think personally, and I bet a lot of us could relate to this, we've all been in a situation where we're not sure how someone is feeling or what's happening. And it feels bad, like to be unclear about how someone feels about you, or what they think about you, or if they're mad about you, or if they have a boundary, feels unsure and yucky. I do not like that feeling. I would rather someone be clear with their boundaries, so I know what's expected of me. I know where I can dig in, or where I need to stand back, where I need to respect, or where I can push a little bit harder. And even if not everybody likes you or understands it, at least they know where they stand.
Well, and coming back to this section of having boundaries for ourselves and looking in the mirror, being clear to yourself is kind to yourself. It's good. It's good self-talk. It's good mental health awareness for yourself. And so what are some practical things that we can do? Because me being a people pleaser, and also me being so passionate about the work I do, I've had to set up some really personal boundaries around work and life home balance, so that I'm not all weekend responding to parent text or parent messages or whatever. And so, just be very clear with yourself. I remember when my kids were little, we had this kind of guideline that whenever we ate dinner together, of course, no phones for any of us, but we would kind of add on an hour. So we would have at least 2 hours in the evening, and it would shift depending on our schedule, like the exact time. I tried to do a 5 to 8. Well, that didn't do it, because then, every night's different. And then something comes up, and then there's this school performance or whatever. But just being intentional about, when you're all at home, saying, okay, for the next 2 hours, can we just put away our phones? Let's have dinner and let's just reconnect. And just very intentional about that. I also had a counselor one time, we work from home, and she said to me, when you leave your office for the day and you turn off the light, I want you to envision leaving all the nextTalk problems in the office, and you're walking into your living room, and you're not going to think about them until tomorrow, because they're still going to be there. That was me setting a clear boundary of work is not going to live in my mind rent free and steal family moments from me. I had to create that clear boundary. So these are the kinds of things we're talking about. These are, this is really a mental, emotional one, where I had to really think about in my mind, what do I need to do so that my mental health doesn't deteriorate here? This is an example of, making clear boundaries for yourself.
That's so good and practical. And I want to say that's what we're talking about here. And a lot of that is just being aware. I'm feeling stressed in this situation, or I really like when this happens, or this makes me uncomfortable, and just taking that extra step. And you can even set a time frame, like, for the next month, I'm going to focus on how I'm feeling as I, work throughout my life and how I operate in my daily living, and be more aware of what I'm feeling in different situations, and maybe refresh my set of boundaries so I can be healthy. I think you can just approach it like that, real practical, and be more aware of what those boundaries are, and start communicating them to your family and your loved ones.
Absolutely. So number one, you have to have those boundaries for yourself. You do. Number two, you have to model those boundaries.
Oh man, it gets so hard when we get to number two.
I mean, you can have the boundaries all you want, but if you're not actually doing it, your kids are going to see that you're not actually doing it and that boundaries really don't matter, right? They really don't make a difference. And of course, we mess this up. And you can say, the other night I messed this up. I was really stressed about work at dinner and I was snapping at my family. Dear Matt was like, hey, anything bothering you at work? and I told him, I said, the leaving it in the office at 5, my boundary, I'm not doing well at that right now. I'm not, and I just clearly communicated that I messed up. I had this boundary in place to protect our family time and because we're human. But I think it goes a long way because you're telling your kid, I'm having these boundaries. And then when you do screw it up, it's not like, oh, they don't matter. It's just, I got overwhelmed. Like, just like you said, Kim, clearly communicating your feelings in that moment is so important.
That's so good that you shared that because in modeling boundaries doesn't mean they're going to be perfect, but it also models for our kids that it's okay for them to make mistakes too. The important thing is to have the boundary in place and to be aware of it and to know when you've crossed the line and to recognize how that feels because you didn't feel good bringing that to the dinner table. It's not like it made things better. And so that's part of the conversation too is, you know what? I crossed the line of my boundary and here's the fruit of that. And I think that's fantastic for our kids to see both sides of that story. And modeling is part of that when it goes well and when it doesn't. And again, these are practical things. When you communicate your boundaries and your kids see you following through, when you say, you know what, in the evening, I'm going to set my phone up or one of our boundaries on Sundays is we try to limit screen time unless it's something we do together. We put our phones up. We will maybe watch an episode of a show or a movie together, but we try to do other things that don't involve a screen. And if I'm over there on my phone all day and I'm yelling at my kids, like, turn off the TV or get off the Xbox, they're not going to learn to respect those boundaries because I'm not modeling that myself. And therefore, I'm basically saying with my actions, it's not really important. So this modeling piece, as hard as it is, it's super important.
Well, and I think too, when you've set up some boundaries for yourself, like for me, work-life balance has been a big deal, right? And because I'm a people pleaser and I'm passionate about what I do. And so it's a big deal. And so I think also like the piece of modeling is when I'm asked to do something like maybe volunteer at the school or volunteer at church, and my kid will see me say no. And it's not because I don't think that's a great thing. Like somebody needs to do that. And that's an important role. And I pray that somebody else steps up. But I also know my limitations and I'm not willing to sacrifice that family time that I've tried to carve out every day. And even working is hard to do that. So why would I add something on top of it? And I think when your kids see that, it's almost like they know. And I've communicated to my family before, I would love to volunteer at your school that way, but my priority is my family and then my work. And I can't do both of those and add this on top of it. Like I just simply cannot do that. And again, it's that we have the boundary personally in our mind, what we know we're capable of. It's like a fence to protect our mental health, right? And then the modeling piece, the second step comes in when I have to actually say no and then communicate with my kids to make it kind of like a teachable moment of why I'm saying no.
Yeah, totally. And you can start this when they're young with things that they can relate to. Like I used to tell my kids, mom is a pie, an apple pie. We all love apple pie. And there are only so many pieces in the pie. And this piece of the pie is for work. This piece of the pie is for you. There's 3 of you and there's dad. And, the pie is getting smaller and smaller. And then someone asks me for a piece of the pie. If I give them a piece, it's going to take your piece and you're not going to get any pie. And they're like, I want pie. You can really make it understandable for young kids and start this conversation young so that as they get older, it just makes sense. They learn how to set boundaries for themselves because they've seen it done so well.
I know one boundary that I had to set for myself was a long time ago. I yelled at my son when we were doing homework because I was on my phone dealing with a work issue and trying to help him with his homework. And I was just divided, right? And I got short with him and I just handled the whole situation wrong. And that was, I told him from now on, when I'm helping you with your homework, my boundary is I'm not going to have my phone in here.
Yeah.
And so I had to stick to that. Like I had to, step one was I set the boundary for myself, but step two, I had to model that. And I just remember a couple times after that when I would say, oh, wait a minute, let me put my phone on the mud bench while I help you. Because if it goes off in my back pocket, I don't want to just knee jerk reaction, take it out. Because that's what we do. We don't think about it, right? We're so connected all the time. And I just think it spoke volumes to his little heart. He was in elementary age at the time, but I think it spoke volumes of like, I'm important. And mom is creating a boundary because that's how important I am. And so you can see how this modeling boundaries can strengthen the relationship with the people you love the most if they see you modeling it well.
Yeah, so true. So true. And so here we are with step one, having our own boundaries, looking in the mirror. Step two, we've got to model those boundaries for our kids. And then we have to teach boundaries to our kids. And, it's easy when they're little bitty because we get to set the boundaries. That's our role as parents. Like, here's bedtime. Here's what you're going to eat. Don't cross the road without looking left and right. Like all of those very practical boundaries are the beginning of keeping our kids safe. But it's got to grow with your child, and we have to transfer that ability to create boundaries to them. They've got to learn how to recognize how they're feeling, what makes them comfortable, uncomfortable. They need to understand God's boundaries in their life and why they are there to keep them safe. And so that process of transferring that control over setting boundaries for themselves is the teaching piece. And again, we want to do that with, yes, talking to them about what God says. Yes, modeling, but also teaching them about discernment. I think that's one of the biggest parts of learning how to have boundaries for yourself is discerning what's happening in a relationship, what's happening in a moment, and is this healthy for me or not?
Man, that's really good. And my mind goes a couple of different places and examples there. I think about teaching your kid to be a self-advocate and teaching your kid to self-regulate. I want to share a practical screen example that popped in my mind as you were talking. And then I also want to share a relationship example. So my thought went to my kid and his Xbox. He's always loved it, right? And when he was little, I would dictate how much time he would have on that screen. I would set the boundary for him. You do your homework, you have an hour or whatever, like that was the thing. But as he got older, I thought, I don't want him going off to college and I'm not there to tell him to turn off the screen. Like I have to teach him to discern, to self-regulate when he needs to turn off the Xbox. And so there were a couple moments, that he would get really mad and angry and I would let it play out. Like he would get mad at the game and he would throw his controller or whatever. And I would let him just be in that moment because I felt like he needed to feel it. He needed to feel what being unhealthy on a screen felt like for a moment. And then, a couple hours later, or maybe next morning on the way to school. So then we're having a conversation. Hey, I noticed you threw your controller the other day. Like, what do you think happened? And then the conversation becomes like, well, you're growing up. And so what I want you to do is start understanding when you're in a moment where you're escalating like that, you can step back and create a boundary and say, I need to stop this right now. Or it's about self-control, and they've got to learn this skill with screens, with scrolling on TikTok, with whatever it is. They need to learn this skill, and it will translate into their eating habits and to their exercise habits, like all areas of their sleeping habits, all of them. But you're having these conversations about boundaries that they're setting up for yourself. A perfect example is, we've always done no phones in bedrooms, always. Well, I mean, right now my son is 15. And honestly, even if I told him right now he could have his phone in his bedroom, I don't think he would because he's focused on being the best athlete he can be. And so he's sleeping, he's eating, he's doing all the healthy life habits. And so it's almost like I don't even want that. Mm-hmm. Camo just growled. Hold on. It would be almost like he doesn't even want that. So that's like a practical example of where my mind went to as far as screen time, Kim. But the other example is I just thought about, if you're really good at teaching boundaries to your littles all through their life, right? With friendships, with little things, they're going to grow up and they're going to start dating. And what's going to happen is the first conversation And I say dating, okay, they define it all different ways. They are
Yeah.
like talking for a while and then they make it official and they actually take on the label of girlfriend, boyfriend, like there's levels. I know all that. But I'm just saying, once they make it official, the first conversation they're going to have is about boundaries. What's cool is you don't even have to say that. They just automatically know that's a conversation for a healthy relationship that needs to happen right now because you've modeled it all these years. It's the
So
coolest
cool.
thing to watch, as you've taught boundaries over and over in little things, that these big things happen and they just know, okay, we got to talk about boundaries here.
Well, and I think the reason that can happen is as you set up boundaries and then you see them creating their own, that is where we also have to shift into like the cheerleader. I saw that you did that and it was so good, or I'm so proud of you, or that was really healthy, or I noticed you made this boundary and I can really see the difference in your life right now, or in how you're feeling, or in your relationships. And so we shift from being like the dictator of the rules to the cheerleader of their boundaries. And so they feel confident and encouraged, like, oh, okay, I know what I'm doing, or I'm doing a good job here. So as they go off into the real world and they're dating, or they're, doing different things, or they're having a job, we help to build up that confidence so that they know it's healthy and safe and right for me to make these boundaries on my own. And that's such a sweet spot. That's what we want, to launch our kids into a place where they protect their heart and minds, where they create their own boundaries. That is definitely the goal. And I think one thing I want to really impress upon parents here is their boundaries are going to look different than yours. And that's good. And that's okay. And sometimes we can get a little discouraged, or we think like, oh, I don't understand. Why would they do that? Or I don't feel that way. And it's so important to step back when we're feeling that and think, okay, is this a personal thing and I'm making it about me? Or is this a moment where I need to say, okay, my kid is becoming independent and this is good that their boundaries are different. They're still respectful and they're still healthy. They just look different, and then celebrate those with them. I think that's just one of those little things. Like me, I'm a hugger. This is a real practical example. I hug the mailman, not rubbing the back. Like we don't do that. But, if I meet someone, I grew up in a culture where that's just what you do. And so it's very natural to me. And two of my kids, like they are not having any of that. And I struggled with that at first, like, oh my goodness, why wouldn't you want to hug everybody? But that's a
You're like, I've raised a Mandy. What has happened over here?
Like, what did she say to you? Man. But it's, what? I have learned to respect that is a boundary for them, and it's okay. It doesn't mean they're a bad person or they're not nice. They just show affection and acceptance of other people different than I do. And so encouraging their boundaries, so important, and being okay that they're different than yours.
Piggybacking on that example, we've said on this show before, especially when we're talking about like sexual abuse and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like if your kid does not want to hug an adult, and we all find ourselves in this situation. You're visiting family out of town or whatever, and you're getting ready to leave, and you're like, okay, give Uncle so-and-so a hug. And your kid does not want to hug them.
Yeah.
Never make your kid hug an adult. Never. And I liked what you came up with. You saw it on a show somewhere. I remember you got the idea from somewhere else, but you implemented it and you gave your kids the option of a hug or a high five. Yeah. And so that's what you say now when you're like leaving family or leaving adults. Hey, give them a hug or high five or whatever. It's just a way to be kind. But then it gives, again, you're giving power to your children to make that decision, to become a self-advocate, to learn to discern for themselves instead of telling them what to do. Because sometimes we don't know best. Like we think, oh, hug the person, it shows respect. But what if that person's a predator and we don't know it? Like we are not God. And sometimes we get this wrong, parents. And so I do think learning to respect your kids' boundaries and where they want to be with them is so, so critical.
And on that same note, we don't know what other people's experiences are. We don't know, what they've gone through or what's important to them or what's not. And so that final piece and that we need to implement in our home and teach our kids is respecting other people's boundaries. Going back to, I'm a hugger. Not everybody is. Not everybody wants to be hugged like Mandy Majors. Just kidding.
Matt, every time you come over, he's like preparing. He's like, Kim's going to hug me. Kim's going to hug me.
Oh, I do not respect your boundary, girl. No, I'm just kidding. But
No, you
it,
do.
it
You
is.
do.
It's so important to teach our kids that everybody's boundaries are going to look different, and being sensitive to those, being respectful of them, and honoring them is so very important. And they need to see us model that as well.
Along these lines of like showing respect to others, you know, I do think it's important. I know my kids, you know, a lot of times on Friday night, you guys have family movie night. And a couple of times my kids have said, oh my gosh, text this to Miss Kim. Like we'll be watching a funny video or whatever. And they'll be like, text it to Miss Kim. And I've made comments of, oh, I'll do it tomorrow because tonight's family movie night and I don't want to bother her at all. And even just a funny meme, which I know that you wouldn't, it's not work. It's not, you know, whatever. I know you would be fine with it. I just don't want your phone going off at all. Like, I don't want any distraction for you. And I think my kids seeing that I honor that with you, that that's important to me. I think it's one of the things they admire about our friendship because they think the respect is there, like the boundary is there. You know, there's certain days that I don't want to be contacted with work unless it's an absolute emergency. And they see that you honor that. And it's almost like we're modeling for them because we're respecting each other. We're showing them what true friendship is. The other thing, a couple boundaries that come to mind are just, you know, posting about your kids on social media, like respecting their boundary of what they want out there and what they don't want out there. You know, so many times, like my kid does something amazing and I will be like, please let me post about it. And they're like, no, it sounds too braggy and I don't want anybody to know I did that. You know, they helped a kid at school or whatever. And they're like, no. And so I don't post it. But when my kid sees me respect their boundaries, then they think, I like this and I want to create clear boundaries and I want to be friends and I want to date people who respect and honor the boundaries because this is healthy. We're modeling like a healthy relationship. We're modeling so much more than just a boundary when we do this well.
So true. All of it connects together and it's all so important. And immediately thought back again to sometimes we make it about ourselves with these boundaries because I always want to post stuff about my kids. And if you know me, if you are connected to me on social media, it's like 1% of my life 5 times a year because my kids just aren't comfortable with it. And so as much as it's hard for me not to, I want to honor and respect them. And they see that. And you're right. It's real important that they see that and that they know my opinion and my boundary matters.
Well, it's part of creating a safe place. We did a whole show on that, but that's a perfect example of if your kids think everything they tell you is going to get posted, they're not going to tell you anything. And so, you know, what is more important, the post or the relationship? You know, obviously the relationship is way more important. And so it all goes back to like respecting people's boundaries.
One thing I want to say as we're wrapping up here is that whole discernment piece that we talked about earlier and teaching your kids how to listen to that still small voice and how to, you know, pay attention to the feelings that they feel when they meet people and if they're comfortable or uncomfortable and not to ignore that. That is part of that whole conversation with your kids about, you know, God created boundaries and he will also show us in our relationships and in our lives where we need to create a boundary where sometimes we don't even know. And sometimes I am surprised. Like I'll feel like the Holy Spirit saying, you need a boundary here. And I'm not even aware of it. And then I can look back later and say, thank you, Lord, for that word, because now I see why it was important that I step back from that relationship or create a boundary in that situation. And so being in tune with the Holy Spirit also helps us guard and maintain our heart and our mind and keep it in a place where it's healthy. So that's another part of it that I think is a conversation with our kids is listening to that still small voice, listening for the Holy Spirit and developing our ability to have good discernment.
Well, it goes back to the protect your heart and mind. I mean, that's that's a boundary. And like, for example, teaching your kids, you know, pornography, we talk about it all the time, how bad it is for their heart and their mind. You know, we can say pornography is bad. Don't look at it. That's not going to be effective. But if we can say, hey, if you can create this boundary in your life, you won't look at people weird. You won't look at people differently. Your relationship won't be impacted by the objectification that you get through pornography. If we can do that kind of education, then they're more likely to set that boundary up for themselves of, I don't want that in my heart and mind, because they've been taught their whole life why it's bad, why it's harmful, and that it's their job to guard themselves.
And that's why we have to talk about all these hard things, because that's how we empower and encourage our kids to protect their heart and mind, by educating them and then having things like boundaries. We've got to have our own. We've got to model them. We've got to teach them and encourage our kids to respect everyone else's boundaries as well. It's important because boundaries affect every single part of our life.
Thank you so much for joining us, listening, and sharing our podcast. Because of you, this show is in the top 5% of over 2.9 million podcasts.
We have lots of resources for you, from counseling to live events. Or if you have a show idea or a question for our team, visit our website at nexttalk.org. We'd love to hear from you.
At nextTalk, we're more than cyber parenting. It's conversations to connect.
This podcast is not intended to replace the advice of a trained healthcare or legal professional, or to diagnose, treat, or otherwise render expert advice regarding any type of medical, psychological, or legal problem. Listeners are advised to consult a qualified expert for treatment.